What happens when you disrespect the most powerful man on American television, live in front of millions of viewers? Is it just an awkward moment that fades with time, or can a single sentence quietly erase an entire career? During the era of Johnny Carson, there were celebrities who walked onto the Tonight Show as stars and walked away, never to be invited back again. Why did some guests survive uncomfortable moments, while others vanished without explanation? For decades, The Tonight Show was more than entertainment. It was a gatekeeping institution governed by unspoken rules that were never written down but always enforced. Disrespect didn't always mean yelling or open hostility. Sometimes it was subtle, ignoring the format, undermining the host, or crossing a line behind the scenes. But were all of these punishments truly deserved, or was disrespect sometimes just a convenient label for something more threatening, challenging power itself? Some guests openly confronted Carson on air. Others humiliated staff members, crossing a boundary that could never be repaired. And a few didn't offend him publicly at all, but broke something far more dangerous: trust. So where was the real line? Was it about manners, loyalty, ego, or fear of being replaced? In this video, we'll revisit 10 celebrities who crossed that invisible boundary on The Tonight Show and uncover the hidden consequences that followed, sometimes immediately, sometimes years later, but always with lasting impact. When Charles Groden appeared on The Tonight Show, he didn't behave like a typical guest there to play along. Known for his abrasive, confrontational personality, Groden treated the interview less as a conversation and more as a challenge. But did he truly understand whose territory he was entering when he questioned Johnny Carson on live television? From the start, Groden questioned Carson's sincerity openly, suggesting that Johnny wasn't genuinely interested in his guests or their answers. He framed the entire talk show format as shallow, reducing world issues to monologue punchlines. Was this sharp social commentary, or was it a deliberate attempt to undermine the authority of the host in his own domain? And did Groden believe that intellectual honesty excused open disrespect? What unsettled viewers wasn't only what he said, but how he said it. Groden sighed heavily, interrupted repeatedly, and often addressed the camera instead of Carson, as if appealing directly to the audience for sympathy. Was he criticizing Carson as an individual, or exposing the power structure behind late-night television itself? And if so, did he underestimate how carefully that structure protected itself? Curiously, Carson continued inviting Groden back. That raises an uncomfortable question. Did Johnny secretly admire the defiance, or was he tolerating it as a controlled experiment, testing how far confrontation could go before it crossed into something unforgivable? Over time, however, audience patience wore thin. Many no longer saw principled honesty, but a guest acting bored, superior, and dismissive. In an era when respect for Carson was virtually mandatory, Groden stood apart. But was he remembered as brave for challenging power, or as someone who mistook antagonism for courage? And in the end, who truly decides when truth-telling becomes disrespect? By the mid-1980s, Wayne Newton was more than a singer. He was a Las Vegas institution. His conflict with Johnny Carson didn't explode on air, but it began there. Night after night, Carson's monologues mocked Newton with insinuations that, at the time, could seriously damage a performer's reputation. Newton tried the quiet route, first appealing through NBC and asking for the jokes to stop. Nothing changed. So what happens when a star realizes the system isn't listening? Newton chose confrontation. He drove to NBC, entered Carson's office, and demanded an explanation. Carson didn't rise. The exchange escalated, and Newton struck him. Was this an uncontrollable outburst, or the final response of someone trapped beneath a power structure that offered no other remedy? And when conflict leaves the stage and becomes physical, who truly crosses the line? The aftermath is revealing. The jokes stopped immediately. That raises an uncomfortable question. Did Carson back down because he was shaken, or because he calculated that the fight had gone too far to continue publicly? If diplomacy failed but force succeeded, what does that say about how power really operated behind late-night television's polished image? This wasn't a simple hero-villain story. Carson used his platform aggressively. Newton violated a line even more dangerous. Lawsuits followed, bitterness remained, and years later Newton publicly labeled Carson mean-spirited. In an era where deference to the host was expected, Newton refused. But did he win by stopping the jokes, or lose by proving that even stars could be pushed to extremes when the balance of power was never equal? For decades, Bob Hope was one of the most frequent guests on The Tonight Show. To viewers at home, his appearances felt familiar, even comforting. But behind the scenes, Johnny Carson reportedly considered Hope his least favorite guest. How could that be, when Hope was a comedy legend and a childhood idol of Carson himself? The problem wasn't a single explosive incident, it was repetition. Bob Hope arrived with pre-written jokes on cue cards, tightly scripted segments, and a clear agenda to promote his specials, tours, and sponsors. There was little room for spontaneity, and even less interest in real conversation. Was this simply professionalism from an old-school entertainer, or was Hope quietly hijacking the show for his own purposes? What made this especially frustrating for Carson was that The Tonight Show thrived on unpredictability. Johnny built his empire on the illusion of casual conversation moments that felt alive and unscripted. Hope treated the program like a 1,950 seconds variety slot where the host existed to tee up rehearsed material. Was that disrespectful or just incompatible with a format that had evolved past him? Producers reportedly dreaded Hope's visits. Entire segments had to be reshaped around his demands, forcing the show to adapt to the guest rather than the other way around. Viewers could sense it too. The energy stiffened, the rhythm flattened. If the audience noticed something was off, how could Carson not? Hope was never banned. He was too powerful, too beloved. But the warmth was gone. Invitations became obligation rather than enthusiasm. And that raises a final question. Is overt hostility more dangerous than quiet disregard, or is the most damaging form of disrespect the kind that smiles politely while slowly draining the life out of the room? Jerry Lewis had long been known as brilliant but volatile. His clashes with colleagues were almost legendary, yet what ended his relationship with The Tonight Show wasn't a bad joke or an awkward interview. It happened off-camera. So what could possibly make Johnny Carson cut someone off permanently without debate or forgiveness? According to multiple accounts, a technical issue occurred after one of Lewis's appearances, possibly a problem with the cue cards or timing. Whether the mistake belonged to the staff or to Lewis himself remains unclear. What followed, however, was unmistakable. Lewis erupted, screaming at Carson's longtime cue card man in front of the entire crew. He berated and humiliated him so aggressively that the room reportedly went silent. Was this just stress boiling over, or a revealing display of how Lewis treated those he considered beneath him? When Carson learned what had happened, his response was swift and final. Jerry Lewis was never invited back. Why was this incident treated so differently from others? Guests had challenged Johnny, mocked him, and even embarrassed him on air. But the staff were sacred. They weren't interchangeable employees, they were the backbone of the show. Could Lewis have recovered with a sincere apology? Some believed he could have, but no apology came, and that absence mattered. Carson could tolerate discomfort and ego clashes. He could not tolerate cruelty toward his crew. So was Lewis punished for losing control in a bad moment, or for exposing a deeper contempt for the people who made the show work? In the Carson era, many rules were flexible. This one never was. By September 1987, Madonna wasn't just a pop star, she was the center of gravity in popular culture. When she walked onto The Tonight Show, the rules were clear, even if they were never written down. Guests sat in the chair, followed the rhythm, and let the host steer the conversation. But did Madonna ever intend to follow those rules, especially on a stage long dominated by Johnny Carson? Almost immediately, she disrupted the format. Madonna, perched on Carson's desk instead of taking the guest chair, leaned into overt innuendo and turned the interview into a performance with Johnny as a prop. Was this playful provocation or a deliberate seizure of control? And when a guest rewrites the power dynamic in real time, who's actually being disrespected, the host, the show, or the era he represents? What made the moment unsettling wasn't flirtation itself, but intent. Madonna didn't drift into boundary pushing. She marched there. Carson tried to redirect to keep the show within its traditional lanes, yet you could see control slipping. Was he choosing grace over confrontation, or did he realize that confronting her would only amplify her power? This wasn't a meltdown or a blacklist moment. Madonna was too big to punish. Instead, the rules bent. Afterward, she was never given that level of freedom again on Carson's stage. The message was subtle but unmistakable. You may win the moment, but the house still remembers. So, was Madonna being disrespectful, or was she simply demonstrating that the balance of power had shifted? In the late 1980 seconds, celebrities were becoming brands stronger than the platforms that hosted them. Madonna didn't ask permission to prove that. She showed it live. And in doing so, she forced a question that haunted late-night television from that point forward. What happens when the guest becomes bigger than the throne? Throughout the 1970 seconds, Lola Falana was a frequent and welcome presence on The Tonight Show. She was glamorous, talented, and enormously popular in Las Vegas, headlining sold-out residencies and commanding real star power. Then, without warning, the invitations stopped. No farewell. No explanation. Why does someone vanish from television without ever being officially banned? There are multiple versions of what happened. One account suggests Falana spoke too openly on air about racism and discrimination topics that network television in that era carefully controlled. Her comments weren't outrageous, but they were blunt, and they made executives uncomfortable. Was telling the truth itself the offense? And who decided that honesty had crossed the line? Another version places Falana as collateral damage in someone else's feud. During a period when Johnny Carson was relentlessly mocking Wayne Newton in his monologues, Falana reportedly defended Newton or criticized the tone of the jokes. Was that act of loyalty enough to put her on the wrong side of power? And if so, how fragile was a guest's position when standing up for someone else? What makes Falana's case especially troubling is the silence that followed. She wasn't publicly criticized, she wasn't warned, she was simply no longer invited. In the ecosystem of late-night television, disappearance was often more effective than punishment. Viewers moved on and the industry understood the message without it ever being spoken. So was Lola Falana removed for speaking too honestly, for aligning with the wrong person, or for making powerful people uneasy? And if a star could be erased without explanation, how carefully did others have to measure every word they spoke? On Carson's stage. By the late 1970 seconds, Chevy Chase was riding high on fame and confidence. Being asked to guest host The Tonight Show was one of the highest honors in comedy, a sign of trust from Johnny Carson himself. But what happens when someone treats that trust as a spotlight rather than a responsibility? During a 1979 guest hosting appearance, Chase didn't just steer the show, he dominated it. He openly mocked fellow guests, most notably prop comic Gallagher, in ways that felt less playful and more cutting. Actress Barbara Bach appeared visibly uncomfortable during her interview, forced to smile through moments that bordered on humiliation. Was Chase improvising bold comedy, or was he punching down simply because he could? Guest hosting came with unwritten rules. You were a caretaker, not a conqueror. Your job was to keep the rhythm, make others look good, and preserve the tone Carson had built over years. Did Chase understand those rules and ignore them, or never respect them in the first place? And when a comedian uses the host's chair to elevate himself at the expense of others who is truly being disrespected, Carson reportedly wasn't impressed. While Chase continued to appear occasionally, the warmth never developed. He was never trusted to guest host again. The message was quiet, but clear talent alone didn't earn loyalty. Character did. In a system governed by subtle signals, that loss of trust mattered more than any on-air joke. So, was Chevy Chase punished for being rude, or for revealing that power once handed to him would be used carelessly? In the Carson era, guest hosting was a test few failed publicly. Chase did. And the consequences followed, not with outrage, but with distance, a far more lasting sentence in late-night television. For years, Joan Rivers wasn't just a frequent guest on The Tonight Show, she was family. She was Johnny Carson's protege, the comedian he trusted most, the one he regularly chose to fill in as guest host when he was away. To many in the industry, that was Carson's quiet endorsement. Joan Rivers was talented enough to do his job. So how did a relationship built on mentorship and trust end in total silence? In 1986, Rivers accepted a $10 million deal from Fox to host her own competing late-night show. From a career standpoint, it was an extraordinary opportunity. But in the world Carson ruled, this wasn't just business, it was betrayal. Did Joan underestimate how deeply personal that decision would feel to Johnny Carson, or did she believe professional ambition should exist outside emotional obligation? Joan later claimed she tried to tell Johnny before the news became public. She called him, began explaining, and he hung up. That was the last time they ever spoke. No confrontation, no argument, just a dial tone. Was Carson reacting to the competition itself, or to the realization that his chosen successor had moved on before he was ready to let go? What followed was devastatingly quiet. Rivers was erased from the Tonight Show universe. Her name was discouraged backstage. Letters she sent went unread. Apologies were refused. Carson never softened. Was this punishment for disloyalty or an act of control from a man terrified of being replaced? And if Joan Rivers had been a man, would the reaction have been the same? From Joan's perspective, she lost a mentor and a friend. From Carson's, he lost trust and perhaps his sense of authority over a world he built. Neither side fully recovered. Joan Rivers died in 2014 without reconciliation. Johnny Carson had died 9 years earlier, never breaking his silence. So who paid the higher price? The woman who took a risk and was cut off forever, or the man who chose silence over forgiveness? In the end, this wasn't the loudest act of disrespect in Tonight Show history. It was the quietest. And sometimes, silence is the most ruthless power of all. Don Rickles made a career out of insults. His entire persona was built on saying the things no one else could get away with, mocking, needling, and tearing into people with a grin that signaled it was all part of the act. On The Tonight Show, that act often included Johnny Carson himself. But when does playful disrespect stop being comedy and start becoming a challenge to authority? Rickles routinely crossed lines that would have ended other guests' Tonight Show careers. He insulted Carson's age, his demeanor, even his authority as host live in front of millions, yet he kept getting invited back. Why? Because Rickles understood the most important rule, permission. His insults came from a place of friendship, not defiance. Was that distinction enough to neutralize what would otherwise be unforgivable behavior? There were moments, however, when even Carson bristled. The room would tense, the smile would tighten, and Johnny would step in to reassert control. Those moments revealed how fragile the balance was. Rickles could push, but only so far. Did Rickles know exactly where that invisible line sat, or was he constantly gambling that his status as the exception would protect him? This raises a deeper question. Was Rickles truly disrespectful, or was he performing a role that Carson himself allowed and even benefited from? After all, Rickles' chaos made Carson look calm, powerful, and unshakable by contrast. The king remained king precisely because he could tolerate the jester. But that tolerance was conditional. Rickles was never confused about who ran the show. He insulted Johnny but never undermined the structure Johnny controlled. And that difference mattered. In the Carson era, disrespect wasn't judged by words alone, it was judged by intent. Rickles understood that. Many others didn't. Frank Sinatra never needed to raise his voice to assert dominance. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show, he wasn't just a singer or an actor, he was an institution. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere in the room. And that created a rare tension with Johnny Carson. When two symbols of authority share the same stage, who adjusts? Sinatra had a reputation for unpredictability. He could be warm, charming, and generous, or cold, dismissive, and unreachable. On Carson's set, there were moments when Sinatra appeared disengaged, responding minimally, signaling that he didn't feel bound by the usual rules of talk show decorum. Was that disrespect, or simply the behavior of someone who believed he stood above the format itself? Unlike other guests, Sinatra was never punished. He was too powerful, too connected, and too valuable. Carson, known for absolute control of his stage, subtly shifted when Sinatra was present. The interviews felt more careful, less playful. Was Johnny showing respect or acknowledging a rival power he couldn't afford to challenge? What makes Sinatra's case unique is that nothing overtly wrong ever happened. No shouting, no insults, no backstage blow-ups, yet the imbalance was palpable. Sinatra didn't need to disrupt the show to demonstrate his status. His mere indifference did the work for him. And that raises a critical question. Is quiet dominance more threatening than open confrontation? In the Carson era, most guests were expected to defer. Sinatra didn't, and he didn't need permission not to. He existed in a space where the rules bent naturally around him. In the end, this wasn't a story of disrespect punished, but of power recognized. Sometimes the most unsettling challenge to authority is the one that doesn't announce itself at all. Looking across these 10 stories, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Disrespect on The Tonight Show was never judged by volume alone. It wasn't always about shouting insults or public embarrassment. Sometimes it was a glance, a refusal to play along, or a decision made quietly behind closed doors. In the era of Johnny Carson, power didn't need to announce itself. It simply decided who stayed and who disappeared. Some guests crossed the line openly and paid immediately. Others challenged the format, the staff, or the hierarchy itself and were erased without explanation. A few were simply too powerful to punish, forcing the rules to bend instead. What these cases reveal is that The Tonight Show wasn't just a stage, it was a system, one built on loyalty, restraint, and an unspoken understanding of who truly controlled the room. But this leaves us with uncomfortable questions. Were these celebrities punished for genuine disrespect, or for threatening a carefully guarded throne? Was Carson protecting the integrity of his show, or the authority that came with it? And how many careers were quietly reshaped by moments the audience never fully saw? Now we want to hear from you. Who do you think crossed the line the most? Was Johnny Carson right to cut people off permanently, or did his silence sometimes go too far? Share your thoughts, your reactions, and your opinions in the comments below. These stories don't end with one answer, and that debate is exactly what keeps them alive.